Good afternoon, everybody. Let's get started. My name is Tom Banchoff. I'm director of the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, and I'm delighted to welcome you to a lunchtime discussion with Stephen Knapp on his recent book, The Predicament of Belief, Science, Philosophy, and Faith. Steve is known to many of you as the president of George Washington University across town. So we're delighted to have you over here on our campus this afternoon. He's also a professor of English at that institution. Before coming to GW, he was the Dean of Arts and Sciences and then the Provost at Johns Hopkins. Before that, he taught English literature at Berkeley. So in addition to his administrative responsibilities, he has an active life as a scholar, a leading scholar of Romanticism, English literature as it relates to issues of philosophy and religion. He's also got a number of honorary accolades and memberships, which I won't go into. I will say that he is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, among other accomplishments and recognitions. We're delighted that you're here with us today, Steve, to talk about your book and some of the issues that it raises. It's really a great point of entry into questions at the intersection of philosophy, religion, and science in our contemporary era, where there's so much interest and so many discussions going on, and you can see by the size of the crowd here the interest in these critical topics. So the way we'll proceed is Steve will speak for maybe 20-25 minutes, laying out some of the themes of the book, in particular as they relate to questions of pluralism. I may have a question or two of transition before we open it up to all of you and have a more general conversation. So without further ado, welcome.
Well, thanks very much, Tom, and I really am grateful to everyone for giving up your lunch hour, if not exactly your lunches, to come here for this discussion. And I'm very glad to be, this is my second visit to the center here, and I very much admire the work of the center, and of course it is a beautifully designed facility, so it's a great place to have an academic discussion of this kind and on many other topics. I thought I would tell you a little bit about how this book came about, and then give a very brief sort of overview of what the focus of the argument is. And then I will be sort of zeroing in on the question of religious plurality, because I know it's a particular interest to the work that goes on here in the center and to many of you. But of course, I'm happy to talk about any of the topics that may be of interest to those who have looked at it or are intrigued or annoyed or otherwise provoked by anything I have to say, either in the book or in the conversation today. So this is actually, it is a very much a collaboration, really sentence by sentence, which is a little unusual, I think. It's not too unusual in the humanities to have books with chapters that are largely drafted by one person or another, with maybe some revision by a colleague. But this one was really written through countless drafts back and forth, and I think it's really critical to the nature of this book that it emerged from that kind of dialogue, because these are the kinds of arguments that if one begins to pursue a path based on one's own reflections and reading and so on, it'll go in a certain direction, but it's really hard to kind of keep pulling it back to what the core issues are without a critic in the form of a collaborator who says, no, that's getting off track of what we really set out to discuss, and you're following your own interests but not following the course of the argument. And it also comes out of a more than 25-year correspondence and discussion, some of that face-to-face, a lot of that by email, and I can tell you many thousands of emails. It's a little scary to realize the quantity of exchanges that went into this, but it goes back to a time when I was on a sabbatical from the University of California at Berkeley and was writing a book about literary theory, actually, and was a visiting scholar at Williams College in Williamstown, Massachusetts, which was of attraction partly because I had some colleagues there that I'd known for many years, but also because it's pretty isolated. In fact, it's rather astonishingly isolated, especially certain times of the year where you cannot get out of the valley. So it seemed like a good place to sit and write a book. But one of my neighbors in the small village of Williamstown was at that time, a junior faculty member in the philosophy department at Williams named Philip Clayton. He's since held a number of positions. He's a very prolific author of books on theology and philosophy and the history of philosophy. And he is currently serving as the provost of a newly created interfaith university. It's part of the Claremont system. It's called Claremont Lincoln University. Just came into being last year, and he's also the dean of an older institution, which is Claremont Theological Seminary, which is a Methodist seminary in Claremont, California. So we met and started talking about these issues without the idea that we would ever write a book about these questions. And we have done some other writing on science and religion in the past as part of, for example, the Center for Theology and Natural Science at the University of California, Berkeley, where I have a number of graduate students who were, I don't know if you're familiar with this, but the Graduate Theological Union there has a system where PhD students in the Theological Union have to have a faculty member from the Berkeley faculty on their doctoral committees. So that's how I got to know a lot of people that were working in these areas, including the faculty and staff at what was known as the Center for Theology and Natural Science, which still exists at the University of California and at the GTU. So I'll just tell you about what the nature of the book is a little bit for those who hadn't had a chance to look at it. It begins by considering what we call the predicament of belief, and what we have in mind there is the fact that many people today, not everyone we expected this might be of interest to, but a lot of the people we hope this book would interest were those who, like us, are very not only cognizant of, but sympathetic to the criticisms of religious belief, religious claims that have been made from the perspective of science and philosophy, but also some of the more, so I guess I would say, ethically motivated criticisms of religion, all of which add up to a series of doubts, sources of doubt in the truth of traditional religious claims, but who nevertheless find themselves, despite their sympathy for those criticisms, nevertheless find themselves still drawn in varying degrees to those traditional claims because they seem to them to be, in one degree or another, true. And the question is, how you negotiate that dilemma, that how do you live with that predicament, and how you think about the relation between, on the one hand, the objections to which one is sympathetic, and on the other hand, one's abiding attraction to the claims that those criticisms are aimed at. And so we thought the best way to sort of get this started would be to lay out in the opening chapter what we took to be the most salient reasons for doubting traditional religious claims. We took our own tradition as the central focus, though with the hope that these would be mutatis mutandis applicable to other religious traditions as well. And so we looked at a series of reasons for doubt, starting with the explanatory power of science. And I probably don't need to go into more of that because everyone is familiar now with the rather aggressive campaign being waged against religion by scientifically oriented philosophers and scientists themselves, natural scientists themselves. This has been promoted under the rubric of the new atheism, which is maybe an extreme and some would argue overly popularized version of these arguments, but of course the arguments have been around for a long time. And what they really boil down to is a sense that there's no need for religious truth claims because everything we need to explain can be explained within the terms of the sciences. So that's in a crude generalization. That's the first reason for doubt. Another one is what is traditionally known as the problem of evil. And that's the question of how a just and benevolent God could tolerate the suffering of innocent beings, sentient beings, which is, of course, an ancient conundrum, which we also take very seriously. And then there are others as well. There's the question of what it means to rely on an historically grounded set of truth claims in an era of critical historiography that calls into question the bases of those claims in terms of the ancient documents and their reliability. There are more specific issues having to do with Christianity in particular. For example, the massive implausibility of the resurrection testimony, just sort of prima facie implausibility of that claim, which of course is itself emphasized in the New Testament documents themselves. This is the kind of thing that one just automatically believes. And so we sort of march through those issues, and not rather mechanically. I'd say there's a lot of going back and forth, but basically the way the book proceeds is with a chapter following that discussion of reasons for doubt. There's a chapter on the issue of science, which actually argues for a metaphysical perspective that ultimately concludes that there is more reason to think that there is a mindful rather than a mindless origin of reality, of the reality that we find all around us. And I can go into those arguments if anybody's interested, but I won't take you through those. Some of those are somewhat technical arguments about the philosophy of science. In any case, we end up with what we call a position of minimally personalistic theism. And essentially what that amounts to is the claim that the origin, what we call the ultimate reality, is more likely to be mind-like than mindless, and it makes sense to think of that mind-like reality as having elements of the personal. We say that reality needs to be not less than personal, but we also stop short of what would be regarded as an anthropomorphic interpretation of what that mind-like ultimate reality would be like. Then we take on directly the problem of evil objection. We come up with a rather detailed response to that problem. And again, I can summarize this briefly now and go into more detail if anyone's interested. Essentially, the argument is that you could not have the kinds of agents that we argue that a benevolent ultimate reality would be interested in if it wasn't possible for suffering and death to occur in a world structured more or less like ours. That's a very traditional argument that I can point to lots of predecessors for. But the slight wrinkle on it is we actually come to the point of arguing that God could not intervene even once to prevent a case of innocent suffering without incurring an obligation to intervene in all such cases. That then raises the question, is there any divine action in the world whatsoever? And we give it an argument to the effect that, yes, there can be still forms of divine action that don't take the form of an intervention that would create that problem. So that's a very brief summary of the argument. And as I say, it's a rather highly technical argument, perhaps the most technical part of the book. But the purpose of it is just to clear the way for saying that we don't think the problem of evil is an insurmountable obstacle to belief in what we call minimally personalistic theism. But the problem is that we arrive at the end of that third chapter of the book is minimally personalistic theism is not a very religiously interesting view. It's in fact a pretty empty, a pretty bland position, and of course it doesn't have any of the richness, concreteness, or affective, aesthetic, emotional appeal, let alone spiritual depth of any of the religious traditions that one would have an interest in entertaining, including one's own tradition, but any others one might want to look at. And that brings us to a chapter 4, on the whole issue of religious plurality. And the way we get there is by saying, if you're going to have a serious interest in religion, you're going to want to ask the question, not just does metaphysics give us a response to the new atheism, but to the question of, is there a way of testing the claims of the rich traditions that humankind has inherited from centuries of religious reflection and practice and spiritual practice. And so the position on religious plurality, just to give you, again, a very brief overview of it, there tend to be two different responses to the question of how you sort of decide which religion is true. One of those is there's no way to decide which religion is true because all of us tend to gravitate towards the ones in which, that we have some personal reason to be sympathetic with, either because we were raised in that tradition or because it appeals to us for some other biographical reason. But it's hard to step back and give a general account. In fact, we argue explicitly that minimally personalistic theism provides no help in deciding which of the variations on theism are true, or even the things that are not quite theistic, but religions that, versions of Hinduism, let's say, that have quasi-theistic elements. You can't exclude any of those or include any of those based on the rather thin outcome of the first three chapters of the book. So then the alternative to saying there's simply no truth of the matter then because there's no way of comparing these religions. By the way, a kind of rich version of that argument is the one associated with John Hick's work on interpretation of religion. And it's essentially the argument, he calls it a sort of quasi-Kantian argument, that each religious tradition is a perspective on the ultimate reality, but we have no reason to believe one of them more than any other. They are the way things appear to us, but they have no real correspondence to what is ultimately the case, right? And so that's one, you could regard it as an idealist or as a skeptical or a Kantian response to the problem of religious plurality. It's one way in which thinkers about these issues go. The other one, though, is to say religious plurality doesn't matter because we have every right to simply rely on our traditions that seem to us to be true. That's associated with theories of what are called basic beliefs that come out of a theological school or a religious philosophical school associated with Calvin College that's now sort of moved to Notre Dame. and it's associated with the work of Alvin Plantinga, Nicholas Wolterstorff, who's actually at Yale at the moment, but they sort of started this movement at Calvin College toward what was called Reformed Epistemology, and it was essentially the argument that we have just as much right to believe in our religious dispositions, to accept the deliverances of our religious dispositions, as we do to believe in the existence of other minds or other things we can't prove philosophically, and the fact that people disagree is sort of irrelevant to our ability to believe those things. We actually think both of those solutions, which are the typical way in which the field kind of divides, both of those go too far in our view. And what we argue for is that there is a right to believe what one is inclined to believe, but one should at the same time recognize that the epistemic claims of beliefs that are not discussable or accessible or criticizable by others who don't share one's own experiences is actually significantly weaker. The epistemic strength of those beliefs is actually significantly lower than the strengths of beliefs that can be confirmed in discussion with others. So in other words, we sort of take on board the problem in a way that we think is more serious than the Reformed epistemologist would take it on, but we don't go in the fully skeptical direction or skeptical or idealist direction that someone like Hick would go, in simply saying that there is no ultimate reality. We simply have the way things appear to us, and we can't get beyond that. Then the question is, okay, what do you do next? And the rest of the book, well, at least the next two chapters of the book, explore Christian claims in particular. I won't give you a whole summary of that because that does go into a fair amount of detail. It's mostly focused on the resurrection claims for reasons that I think, justify in terms of what are the most salient issues raised by the claims of Christianity per se, in terms of the uniqueness of Jesus, the authority of Jesus, and so on. And we give an account of what those claims amount to within the terms of our theory of divine action that came out of our response to the problem of evil. So essentially what we do is we take that argument that came out of the problem of evil discussion, which is what we call the not even once principle, that God cannot intervene in a way that would incur an obligation to intervene in other cases. So you don't have miracles in the conventionally understood sense, and yet we do argue that there is a divine communication with human beings that is still possible within that framework, and we interpret the resurrection claims essentially from that point of view, what we call a participatory account of the resurrection claims, which has to do with a communication between divine and human agents, in which the disciples of Jesus and subsequent believers find themselves in a position to have a relationship with the ultimate reality that is based on Jesus' relationship, both causally and symbolically, and we give a rather detailed account of that over the course of 2 chapters. Then we step back and we ask the question, what is the epistemological basis of all this? And there we actually give a sort of religious epistemological theory. Again, it's somewhat technical, I can go into that, but essentially it asks the question, what do you do as a rational agent with beliefs that you can't discuss with other people? And we sort of give a kind of layering or a series of levels of strength, of epistemic strength, that moves from the strongest cases where a community of experts agrees to the weakest cases where one is not oneself sure that one has reason to believe the things that one is inclined to believe, and I suppose you can go further from that to cases where one doesn't actually believe or only occasionally believes, but still is interested in the symbolic implications of a religious claim, so that you get a kind of hierarchy of states of belief. The important thing to say about that is there is no necessary correlation between epistemic strength and commitment. That is to say, one can be strongly committed to beliefs that one isn't sure one has reason to believe, and much more weakly committed to beliefs that one has every reason to believe. So for example, my belief that the English poet John Milton was born in 1608 is a belief that I actually hold pretty strongly, but if somebody said to me that's actually based on a clerical error made in an encyclopedia 100 years ago, it wouldn't break my heart to discover that was not true. I'm not committed to that belief, but on the other hand, I think it has a high degree of epistemic strength because it's what all us Miltonists would believe, right? But there are other things that I'm not sure that are very important to me, but I'm not sure I can defend them not only to you in a discussion like this, but even defend them to myself, and yet they still have a strong level of commitment. And what we do is we sort of look at traditional Christian claims moving all the way from pretty broadly shared impressions of a person like Jesus, namely that he was sort of an impressive, charismatic figure, to rather highfalutin theological claims about the Trinity and incarnation and so on. And we sort of show how one's level of both personal and epistemic commitment to those claims can vary across a pretty wide spectrum. And so what you end up with is a position which you call a kind of minimalist position. What we mean by saying it's minimalistic, that can be understood in two different ways. It's minimalistic in part because we reduce some of the content claims of the traditional faith, but it's also minimalistic in the sense that we don't, that we take pretty lightly the status of our own ultimate conclusions, and we don't think there's a very strong lineup between personal commitment on the one hand and epistemic strength on the other. It's not a skeptical position. But it is a rather intermediate position between the various alternatives. So that's kind of in the nutshell where we stand. I think the issue for plurality is that we do think that there is a real obstacle to, obviously, dogmatic conviction that is a result of recognizing that other people have the same entitlement to their religious beliefs as one has to one's own. We don't think it follows from that there's no truth of the matter, but we do think it follows from that one has to be extraordinarily open, tolerant, and so on. All the things that you would expect would follow from such a position.
Great. Well, thanks for that wonderful overview of the book, which, as you can see, touches on a few small issues. And maybe as a way of framing the conversation, you could say a little bit about the genealogy of your arguments. I mean, these ideas that we need to bring together the worlds of science, philosophy, and faith, that we need to change the way we think about religion in light of science, go back at least to Kant, and you can trace them up through liberal Protestant theology in particular, which had its heyday about 100 years ago. How do you see your efforts in that wider tradition, and what's new about the current moment in terms of the arguments that you're putting forth and the way in which these issues are being posed?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good set of questions. I mean, I would say, my co-author was a student of Wolfhard Pannenberg, who was somebody who was regarded as a kind of rationalist in an era in which there was the ascendancy of so-called neo-orthodoxy, which took a pretty dim view of the kind of thing that Pannenberg was doing, which was, for example, deriving religious claims from anthropology and so on. But anyway, but taking the deliverances of various disciplines and using those as a way of building a theological position, but with a very strong evidentialist take on Christian claims per se, notoriously writing that the resurrection was something that could be rationally established on the basis of the evidence, although his interpretation of the resurrection was a little bit ambiguous, but nevertheless it was within the spectrum of positions that were kind of current when my co-author was a graduate student and so on. He actually went to Munich and studied personally with Pannenberg. So he was kind of coming out of that sort of perspective. I suppose mine, I was a student of Romanticism. We both had in common actually an interest in the whole German idealist tradition in Kantian philosophy and post-Kantian philosophy, which he came to through his work in the history of religious philosophy, and I came to it out of a study of Romanticism. So we had that kind of common basis. By the time I met him, I was intrigued by the analytic. I was probably coming more out of the analytic tradition. He was probably coming more out of the continental tradition of thinking about this. I was coming more out of the Anglo-American tradition, and that was dominated at the time by people like Richard Swinburne, making a very highly rationalistic, sort of inferential argument for the truth of religious claims. But at the same time, there were people who were writing about religious epistemology in a variety of interesting ways, and that includes people like Plantinga and Walter Storff, who, these are very, Plantinga is a brilliant analytic philosopher, working across many fields in analytic philosophy, but right around the time that I started becoming involved in these questions, there had been this volume that came out of that Calvin College world, which was called The Rationality of Religious Belief, and there were some sort of seminal essays in that volume that influenced us. So we kind of worked our way out of those positions over time by trying out objections to them, and I think we went through a variety of versions of that. We always felt uncomfortable with the basicality argument of Plantinga and Walter Storff, which essentially argues for a parity, and also Alston was another one of these proponents of this, for something like a parity between perceptual belief and religious belief. And it never struck us that that parity was defensible in the long run, because of course one of the things you could say about perceptual beliefs is they are testable and shareable in a way that religious beliefs aren't. That kind of thing doesn't bother Plantinga, because he's only bothered by objections to his religious convictions if they can be shown to be confronted with what he calls defeaters. That is, objections that he can't answer. As long as he can sort of push aside the objection, he thinks his belief is secure. We think the fact that you can't articulate the basis of your own beliefs in a way that can be discussed with others creates a problem for the belief. And that probably comes out of something else that we share, which is, I suppose, an affinity with American pragmatism, and particularly with C.S. Peirce, who's been very influential on my writing in a lot of fields, and probably to some extent on his. So the confluence of several things. It's that Pannenbergian, continental tradition. It's the Anglo-American analytic tradition. Also very strongly for me, the Peircean epistemology, which I don't go all the way with the Peircean epistemology to the point of saying that agreement provides a definition of truth, but we do go pretty far down the road with Peirce in thinking that the fixation of belief has a lot to do with agreement with others who can criticize your belief, and with the doubts, the question of whether you can handle the doubts that are created by that disagreement.
Thank you. Well, I have some more questions, but we've got a lot of folks here who I'm sure have questions as well. We're going to have one microphone circulating, and I'd ask you to raise your hand, and when I should call on you, just to briefly introduce yourself and pose a question. And we'll go sequentially at first. If there are a lot of hands, we can start to combine questions going forward.
I had a general question. We've been talking, Henry Hetker, a researcher now retired federal government, militant theism and militant atheism. You have these issues we're facing today in regard to nuclear weapons. What are your fears or concerns or hopes regarding this serious issue?
Well, so I mean, it certainly is it would be hard for someone who, well, first of all, someone who has that view probably wouldn't read our book. But if it would be hard for someone who did read our book and was sympathetic with almost any aspect of the book to think that it was an appropriate response to the uncertainties that we lay out to have a level of conviction that would justify religious violence of any imaginable kind. Now, that's not a tight logical connection, right? Because we do say, as I was saying earlier, it is possible to have a commitment to a religious claim that is stronger than the epistemic strength of that claim, and we experience that in our own case, and I'm sure everyone around the table does as well. Human beings are not entirely rational in the sense that human beings require, and we think, by the way, we don't think that human beings are rationally required to be entirely rational. I mean, that's, I think, an important kind of caveat in this. We do have an account of rationality, and it takes the form of saying, as rational agents, one has an interest in knowing whether there are good reasons for what one believes. But that doesn't mean that one only has permission to believe those things for which one has good reasons. That's as far as we go with the Reformed epistemology kind of approach. Well, if you take that to its logical conclusion, you could say, look, the fact that I'm uncertain about my belief doesn't mean that I'm not so strongly committed to it that if I think my belief warrants a certain level of violence, I feel that violence is justified. So it's not a logical impossibility for someone to agree with us and still think that religion, that his or her religious commitments require a violent response. Of course, personally, we don't think that any religious commitment requires a violent response. In fact, that would contradict what we think, because of our own tradition, what we think is religiously entailed. But it's not a tight logical fit. Now, if you ask me, am I worried about religious militancy? Yes, I think I am. Given what North Korea is saying right now, I'm also a little worried about atheistic militancy, assuming that they are true to their atheistic ideology, right? So how about militancy in general? I'd like to, I'm not sure that the religious variation is worse than some of the other alternatives that are out there. I saw a statistic, by the way, recently that, because we think of Iran as being this militantly religious country. And there was recently a survey, and I read the results from somewhere, I can't remember who produced it, but it may have been one of these Pew things or something, which showed that actually Americans on average are more religious than Iranians on average, which, you know, gives one pause for thought.
Stay on this side of the room.
You said that certain types of people or certain people would not be interested in reading this book. I'm curious as to what readers did you have in mind when you wrote this book?
Well, you know, again, I think the honest answer to that is those who, we do have the impression that a lot of people share our predicament. And that's a predicament of being, and it's not just academics, but I think a lot of academics would be in this boat, as we certainly are. That is people who, I mean, in my own case, I was trained in the study of English literature at a time when there was something that has been called, that Paul Ricoeur called the hermeneutic of suspicion, if you've heard that phrase. The notion was that every traditional belief of any kind was a product of some kind of distortion, metaphysical or politically motivated distortion. It was an era in which feminist criticisms of traditional, you know, male-dominated literary forms was being developed. There was a kind of confluence of Marxist and Freudian and feminist approaches to literature, and so basically, you know, your job as a literary critic was to find out, you know, the sort of underlying distortions, fictions, violence, in effect, that was behind the tradition of the canon, as it was called, the great classic works of literature. And the idea was to deconstruct those in one way or another, right? I'm just saying that's what my own sort of tradition was coming out of it. So you find yourself in an academic setting in which that's the lesson of the humanities. At the same time, the natural sciences are saying we can explain everything. And yet you still find yourself, for a variety of reasons, which we could go into in any given individual's case, having either experiences or traditional background or whatever it might be that tend to nevertheless incline one in the direction of taking seriously certain of those traditional claims. So how do you negotiate that dilemma? And we think there are a lot of people who are kind of stuck with that. Even before it became the case that so much Christianity in this country was identified with a certain political orientation, which has driven a lot of younger people out of the churches, as you know, is widely documented. I mean, we now have certain age groups are dominated by a category known as the nuns, N-O-N-E-S, who are often, people say they believe in God, but they don't want anything to do with any traditional religion, and they don't believe any traditional religious doctrines, even if they believe, you know, in theism in some general vague sense. So it is a challenging time for that reason for people who find themselves in this particular predicament. So those are the people we thought this would appeal to most. But, you know, I suppose there are people who are just more broadly interested in, you know, the role of religion in society, who are probably wondering how it can be the case that academics in any secular setting, and my university, in contrast to this one, would regard itself as a pretty secular university, how they can survive in that environment and still have any fidelity to traditional religious claims. Yeah.
Just go around the table. Aaron.
Jason Welly, a PhD student in the Religious Pluralism program here. Thank you very much for your talk. I wondered if you could flesh out a little bit, you know, you said that there's no correlation between the relative epistemic strength of my claims, there's not necessarily a correlation between the relative epistemic strength of my claims and my commitment to them. It seems to me that that's, you know, on the spectrum of views you mentioned, from Calvin College over to Hick, with perhaps you and your collaborators somewhere in the middle, that lack of a correlation is the biggest problem for you, because for Hick, you know, and company, the relative strength of my claims, I mean, either way, I don't have the chance for those to get to ultimate reality anyway, and perhaps for Plantinga and company, it's you know, more about internal coherence. It seems to me that part of your argument is to nudge people grappling with the problem of pluralism toward engaging questions of greater relative epistemic strength. You know, that in my engagement with the other, I should be dealing with the issues on which I have some capacity to make my arguments credible to him or to her. Am I hearing that correctly as part of your argument? And do you see that happening?
Well, there's a little bit of a nuance here because the problem with that is, so let's just take something like our interpretation of the resurrection. So we sort of give, again, we give a series of interpretations that range from what we call the, purely symbolic, right? The resurrection is, the resurrection claim is just a way of saying that, there's an endorsement. This is a tradition that endorses certain moral teachings and says those teachings go on, or this is a good example of, the way one should be in relation to God and one's neighbor or something like that. And so all it means to say that Jesus was resurrected is to say that his example remains a powerful example, right? Or he was risen in the faith of the church or something like that. But it's not about Jesus personally, all the way to, of course, very strong Orthodox claims about bodily resurrection and so on, and ascension, and a Christ who sits at the right hand of God and actually hears prayers and so on. Is in contact with millions of agents, and therefore it becomes a problem to explain how he remains the same person, or even indeed a human person who has those kinds of capacities. And then there are all various ways of negotiating that. So there's a spectrum of these beliefs, and if the question is, where does one find oneself in that spectrum of beliefs? Well, let's say you arrive at one of those positions. It's still a question of whether you have good reasons for that position that you hold, and as a rational agent, and certainly one who feels under pressure from rational criticism, you're going to want to know the answer to that. So that's going to involve some level of dialogue, which I don't mean that you have to spend your own time as an agent talking to other people about these issues, but you're going to have to spend some amount of your kind of energy kind of wondering what would people in other traditions think about that belief. For example, because one of our so I'll just give you the sort of 6 steps of the epistemology, right? So at the lowest and therefore the strongest level, so we sort of call it level 1, are beliefs that you not only you think are true, but you think everybody agrees with you that they're true, or at least the relevant community of experts would agree with you that they're true. So that's like the belief that Milton was born in 1608, okay, for the relevant community of experts. At another level, what we call level 2, they're the beliefs that you think that are true and that other people would agree with you if they had the information that you have, or if they weren't making some mistake that they're making. So you have a theory of error for their disagreeing with you, right? And the classic case of a theory of error is, the question of whether the earth goes around the sun or the sun goes around the earth. And the theory of error for people who believe that the sun goes around the earth is it looks like the sun goes around the earth, right? So that's a pretty strong theory of error, but we can explain why it doesn't. And so even though we understand why they believe what they believe, if they're pre-Copernicans, we think we have a theory of error. We think they're wrong, and we're not particularly shaken by the fact of that disagreement, right? Then if you go up to the third level, those are cases where you think that people ought to grant that you have good reasons for your belief, but you don't think there's any reason they should believe or would believe if they had more information, right? It's not just that they're missing something that you see or they're misunderstanding something that you understand. It's that their experience is different enough from yours, their traditional upbringing, whatever it is different enough from yours, that you can understand they're not going to agree with you, but you nevertheless sort of demand of them that they grant that your perspective gives you not only a right, but makes it reasonable, rational for you to hold those beliefs. So that's sort of the third level. Still a pretty strong level of epistemic security, let's say, right? Then there's the fourth level where you're not sure, where you can't expect them to agree with you, but you're not even sure you have good reasons yourself. You really begin to think that, maybe it's only because of your tradition, only because of your childhood, only because of certain emotional, memories or something, that you're drawn to this belief at all, yet you still feel that you have that conviction. So that's where things get really marginal in a way in terms of the epistemic strength, but yet you might still have that very strong conviction. Level 5 is where you have so little reason to believe this is true, but you still find yourself hoping it's true. So that you move there from really belief to hope. And what we call level 6 is where you don't think it's true at all, but you treat it as an important symbol. You say the creed and you believe 2 of the things there, but 5 of them you think are, symbolically interesting, but they're not things you actually believe. But they think, they're powerful. They're good for the music. All that kind of stuff, right? But even at those levels, you can oscillate, right? So you may find yourself, and I think a lot of people have the experience of being skeptical about something that's saying in a creed, but then finding themselves reciting it along with several hundred other people in a worship service, find yourself for that moment believing it. And you can regard that either as what Coleridge called a willing suspension of disbelief, which he called poetic faith. You're sort of believing it for the moment because you're in that fictional world where it seems right to you. But there might be moments in which you slip into actual conviction, but it's not an abiding, sustainable, permanent part of your epistemic makeup. Okay, so across all those layers, you don't always know in advance, and it actually shifts over time where in that field you fit. And any of those could be subject to dialogue with people in other religions, right? You'd sort of wonder what people in other religious faiths would think about your right to believe at any of those levels, and you'd be interested in their criticisms of it. So you wouldn't only be restricting yourself to talking to them about things that you can all agree on. You can also talk to them about things that you disagree on, and that could be a vital and interesting dialogue across those religions. But I don't think what you'd be looking for is a syncretic outcome there where you'd say, okay, we're going to take a little bit of yours and a little bit of mine and kind of blend them together and come up with the true view. I think that's been tried and found wanting. And I think it's also would be a mistake to say, therefore there's no truth of the matter, you just believe what you're going to believe, and we'll, because it doesn't matter anyway, it's only our perspective on the ultimate reality that we can't touch. But you also don't want to say, I don't need to worry about you because you don't have a defeater for my view, and therefore I have no interest in any dialogue with your perspective. So it is a different kind of position on religious plurality.
Maybe I could follow up, just using my prerogative as chair. I'm listening to all these different points. It strikes me that from an orthodox point of view, one could argue that, and maybe you could respond to this, that in effect you're setting up religion, or rather setting up philosophy and science as yardsticks for religious truth. And what would you say to someone who would assert that religious truth is a sort of experiential truth that can't be measured simply by those criteria, and that things like mystery, the category of mystery, or the idea of love or love of God, inhabit some other epistemological realm? I'm sure you've dealt with this in some detail in this and in other writings, but it just strikes me at some fundamental level that you might be setting up religious truth as subordinate, in some sense, to scientific and philosophical truth.
Yeah, and I would say there is not a general answer to that question, because it's going to be highly relative to the agent who's sort of asking that question, right? Because for some of us, it's going to be the case that that the scientific claims are a very powerful potential defeater for religious claims. For example, if there's neuroscientific studies suggesting that religious conviction is a result of certain parts of your brain lighting up, under the influence of certain chemicals that are released by, as a result of biological processes that evolved over time. So, we have this tendency to feel warm and fuzzy when we're with our tribe in a certain setting where the lights are low and the music is, whatever it is. And we prove that because we have this, functional magnetic resonance imaging of the brain that shows us whenever we do that, we get that glow in that one part of the brain. Some people are going to be very impressed by that kind of evidence and say, well, that proves it. I mean, in fact, there are books now being written about that call themselves naturalistic explanations of religion. We can explain away religion. It's kind of like the way a drug works. This is the way religious claims work. And some people are going to be more impressed by that kind of argument than others are going to be, and that's going to be for them. It's going to make it harder to sustain their conviction that the mystery of the love of God and so on is a powerful influence on them. And that's exactly what they're going to have to figure out when they're figuring out whether they've got good reason for what they believe. But I can't give you a general answer to that. I mean, I can't tell you whether for you, your conviction of the love of God is a powerful enough conviction to give you reason that I should respect, to believe what you believe, rather than just thinking you're deluded. And unfortunately, there's no general answer to these questions, and there's not going to be. One of our conclusions is because any individual will find his or her own disposition sliding up and down those scales as things happen. Some of us find ourselves, and you may or may not have had this experience where you read the latest thing in the New York Times science section about religion and say, well, that's it for religion, Or you may feel that when the latest book comes out about, the latest theory comes out about the New Testament and how the New Testament was composed, and you say, well, that gives the lie to that, or the latest, apocryphal gospel, and in fact, who is it that just put out a book, a New Testament, that combines the canonical gospels with some subset of the, the Gnostic gospels and some of these other things that were discovered, and you take someone like Dominic Crossan, who's a powerful kind of historian of early Christianity, and with very skeptical views of the canonical Gospels. And some people would think, okay, that's it. That's that tears it. I can't believe any of that stuff. But others are going to be less impressed by that, and they'll have good reason to be less impressed by it. That's why there's not a general answer. So we're certainly not arguing that any particular field is inherently dominant. It really is relative to the agent's beliefs. So that's why some of us will find ourselves in a predicament that others won't find ourselves in.
So but at the same time, we can use science and philosophy to distinguish between reasonable and less reasonable metaphysical or religious beliefs?
Well, you can't help use it. Depending upon what your beliefs are, it's going to be impossible for you to avoid thinking of science if you have certain beliefs about science. If you're less, some of us are less impressed by the latest neuroscientific research than others, and if we have reason to be less impressed by that, it's going to strike us as less of a potential defeater than it will for others. So that's why, as I'm saying, there's no general answer to the role that science is going to play. What you have are various sources of doubt and various reasons that counter those sources of doubt, and those are going to play out differently for different agents. But a rational agent has an interest in knowing how those play out, which is why you can't just turn your back on it either by saying it's all relative, like Hick, or I don't need to worry about these other people like Flanagan. We don't think either one of those is a plausible outcome, because neither one of those does justice to the situation in which agents actually find themselves in our predicament.
Excellent. We've got a lot more. Let's take two questions at a time now. Over here, and then we'll move into the back corner.
I'm Jason Poling. I'm the pastor of an evangelical church in the Baltimore area, and I want to thank you not only for the book, but your paradigm on epistemic confidence, I think, is going to be helpful to me in marital counseling.
That was the other audience we were aiming at.
Yeah, right. My question, and as a pastor, my interest is in how this cashes out for you, if I can ask that question, in the life of a believer. So if you are in a church service and you say Sunday morning, you may have said Christ is risen indeed, or when you stand up and say the creed, especially when you're articulating some of these exclusive claims, what's going on in your own head, what's going on in your own heart in light of the framework that you've worked out here with Dr.
Well,
Clayton?
I would say it becomes, and not just in light of this framework. I mean, what we've developed is, of course, a way of explaining what's going on in situations that one was already experiencing. So that in my case, I would say, because since I do tend to go to Episcopalian services, which do always, in the case of a Eucharistic service, have either the shorter or the longer version of the creed. That is either the Apostles' Creed or the Nicene Creed. Most of the time, it's the Nicene Creed in most of the Episcopal churches that I've spent any time in, and that's a pretty rough document to get through and try to give the same weight to every claim in that creed, right? So that, and it's not surprising that for a lot of us in contemporary Protestantism, the literal understanding of the doctrine of the virgin birth is pretty tough. And we don't write about that in the book. We could have taken that as an example, and we'd probably end up doing something with it. But the question is, what do you do with it? What's the relation between literal and figurative understandings of that? I mean, more or less symbolic understandings, ethical understandings, understandings in terms of ecclesiology, which is one of the ways in which the Catholic tradition has very powerfully taken those claims. I mean, there are a lot of ways of working it out, I mean, one of the things you find if you spend any time on these things is you can take any one of these claims and come up with a pretty nuanced way of dealing with it, and I suppose it becomes almost a spiritual discipline, because if over time you could actually develop kind of a repertoire for ways of dealing with the claims that you find, sort of tough. And there's still going to be claims in there that are awful tough, and there's certainly claims in the Bible, commandments about Haram, the slaughtering of everyone in a conquered city, are still going to be pretty tough to take literally, or even to find a really satisfactory figurative interpretation of. It's sort of like Islamic believers dealing with the ambivalence about jihad and how you're supposed to understand that. And of course, that's a incredibly fraught issue within contemporary Islam. So people find ways of working these things out, and if you're able to sit through a worship service, which, by the way, not everybody is, and many younger generations, and I mean, this is a huge issue for contemporary churches, is generations of younger people are unable to sit through, and they almost physically incapable of sitting through a worship service. Part of that's because they're looking for their iPhone the whole time. So that is one issue. But another issue is they can't relate to those claims, and they haven't really been taught how to relate to those claims. So I think one of the things that the church is going to have to do if it wants to survive this multiplication of the nuns is find ways of giving believers the tools to deal with exactly the kind of thing that we're trying to deal with here. So if you take something like the Creed, how do you take a claim that you don't find yourself literally inclined to believe in the same document as a claim that you do find yourself literally inclined to believe, and how do you make a holistic spiritual experience out of negotiating it with a document like that? The same thing happens, of course, in worship service, you got readings, because typically there's a Hebrew Bible reading, there's an epistle, and then there's a gospel, and you're supposed to make sense of how they all fit together, but they often seem very sharply contrasting, not only in the content, but in the spirit, and even the ethical implications of what's going on in those readings. So it's a tough thing to negotiate. I don't think the church have done as much as they could to help people negotiate those. They tend to prefer not to talk about it.
Hello, my name is Samira Daniels. My claim to fame is that I have a son who is an alumnus of GWU. So I am media director for 9/11 Unity Walk. It's my fun project, but it has given me an opportunity to come back into the interfaith dialogue. I grew up in that in those circles in the 60s and 70s. And one of the reasons I leave the interfaith circles is I find immense political and religious rivalries also being played out in this, and it's of concern to me because this platform of religious pluralism, of which people like Wilfred Cantwell Smith, who was at Harvard Divinity Center for World Religions and so forth. I grew up in those circles, and from those days up till now, those same sort of petty and in other words, the bottom line is in every effort to have this religious pluralism, I see also these religious rivalries being played out, and I wondered whether if you could speak to that in some way. Thanks.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think it's great to have people that are working on this. I'm actually rather interested in this experiment that's going on in California, which I know about because of my co-author's involvement at the Claremont Lincoln University, is an attempt to have an actual interfaith university, which is to say these will be people who will be from the day one studying these issues so that they can then go out and do exactly what you're doing. The mission of that university is to train people to do the kind of work that you're doing and to give them the tools for doing that, and how to be aware of kind of landmines in inter-religious dialogue, but also how to be appreciative of alternative traditions, but also how to be sufficiently grounded in their own traditions that they can engage in those kinds of dialogue with some degree of security and clarity. And which is not unrelated to what Reverend Poling was saying about what it's like to go through a worship service, because you get the same kinds of ups and downs in interreligious dialogue that you do in your experience as an individual, considering all the options that are being presented to you. So you need kind of skills to negotiate those areas, and I think that's what this interesting experiment may show us a way of doing.
Ken Dante, I also do work with Interfaith, with dialogue, and also visiting different congregations, trying to bring people together, crossing divides. A question maybe about the nuns, again, the N-O-N-E-S, which I've always found fascinating, because I think in many ways that's been my life of not having an absolutely defined religious image and having to go seek to find that. And the validity of being on a journey through different communities to try to find what resonates and what's true. Read an interesting book recently by Jonathan Haidt. Some people may be aware of that, The Righteous Mind, which is just a fabulous book. And he's a sociologist. He's not a religious person, but he talked about hiving. And he says that, a religious idea creates a community, it creates a hive, and of course hives can tend to attack one another or are threatened by each other's bees. And to take the analogy a little further, in my own thinking, it's like there's a queen bee, which is like a queen idea. and a group of people come around that idea, they defend their queen, and they may be threatened by another queen idea that is just as valid. The bees, from a sociological point of view, not a religious point of view, the hives still gather pollen, they still produce honey, they bring bees together, they provide shelter for bees, and they continue life. They pollinate things. How do we get to that point, that further point? How can we get to a point where we're not so threatened by other queen bees or queen ideas? And I think the feminists may like that analogy. I do.
Well, I have read the book. Hyde's book, I think, is an interesting book. I mean, it's of course, what he's arguing for is a sort of a rapprochement between what he sees as a conservative emphasis on, the tribal, the things that hold the tribe together, and the liberal commitment to fairness and justice, which nevertheless disregards the claims of the tribes, and therefore makes liberal politics in this country politically weak. Actually gives it a disadvantage because it has less of an appeal to the core values that evolved as part of this tribal or hive-like mentality that you're describing. Now, at the same time, it's important to say that he's someone who regards religion as absolutely devoid of truth, right? Any truth claims. So he's only, sorry.
He's not anti-religious.
No. He's pro-religion as a social bonding mechanism, which has to be respected by the liberals, but he doesn't think that there's such a thing as religious truth. So he's not interested in the kind of dialogue that I was talking about, where one is interested in relations between religions because of one's commitment to the truth of one's own tradition and one's interest in what other people have to say about that truth. So that part is just swept aside as far as he's concerned, and I think he kind of misses something important in the way he excludes any consideration that there might be any truth to these values other than their social utility, because he's only interested in the social utility side of it. But of course, what he's ultimately arguing is you need a little bit of both. So he would like to see, liberals be more respectful of conservatives, and because it would make them strategically more effective, because they'd be paying attention to values like sacredness and loyalty and so on, which he thinks are underestimated by people on his political side of the spectrum, which is the liberal side. So it's an interesting book. I mean, I think it's, I think it has the limitations that I mentioned. And I think if he paid a little bit more attention to, if it was a little bit less than simply functionalist in his approach to these matters, he could probably get a little further.
Thanks. Thanks for your talk and for being here. My name's Eitan Paul. I graduated from the School of Foreign Service here last year, and I work here at the Berkley Center. My question is, the issues that you raise, particularly in terms of evaluating the epistemological strength of one's faith claims and the level of one's commitment to those claims, is something that I imagine many people consider, non-academics, ordinary people consider, but something that we usually don't engage in dialogue about. What is your perspective on the role of residential colleges like GW or Georgetown or any in the United States that what type of environment should they be fostering inside and outside the classroom to stimulate dialogue about these issues? Is there do you think there needs to be a particular approach taken inside the classroom or in terms of engaging student life around these issues at secular college campuses or religious ones that have a lot of diversity like Georgetown?
Well, I'll say, I mean, speaking of my own students at George Washington, I would say I've been impressed by some of the things they've done. For example, after September 11th, the first one, there was a Jewish and Muslim students got together and started a tradition of having annual dinners in which they would, because there's enough in common between halal and kosher food, that they were able to share meals together, and they started singing prayers from each tradition and so on, and that's now expanded to being an annual interfaith dinner, which goes way beyond the Jewish and Muslim students that originally, it includes Christian, Hindu, Sikh, students in it. Baha'i students have become very active in that, and I've been impressed by how respectful students are of each other's traditions in all these settings, and particularly when it was in some of the tense moments having to do with things that were going on in Israel and Palestine, where the Jewish and Muslim students were still able to maintain that respectful dialogue and not sort of, hive off in these different directions, and so. And then there are a lot of things there are a lot of kinds of programs that go on in residence halls, We have a pretty active sort of student, scholar in residence sort of program for fostering programs that will expose students to each other's traditions. So I'm not so worried about that issue within, the framework of a college campus. I'm sure there's more that we can do along those lines. And none of that is doing what I think is probably only can be done within each of the traditions, which is to give, as I was saying in response to one of the earlier questions, to give individuals within a tradition these skills from the perspective of that tradition for dealing with their own faith and its relation to other faiths. That has to be done within each tradition itself, and it's a little harder to say, let's just have a seminar about that. So again, multiple responses to a very complex problem.
Just to push a little bit, are there ways to actually bring this conversation about faith, science, and philosophy in a more structured way into the curriculum?
Sure.
At a secular university? Yeah.
I think that, we have a lot of students who are not majoring in religion, but nevertheless take courses in it. And some, now so many students double major or have a major and a minor or 2 majors and a minor. And it does give them the opportunity, I think, to get involved in some of these kinds of discussions. I will say that it's probably a minority of students at this point because of the nuns phenomenon who have much of an interest in this. And that's just a challenge we've got to figure out a way to deal with, because they just don't see the need for it, because they think they get enough spiritual fulfillment out of other things they do. And often it's out of service projects. And if you were to go to them, we did actually, a couple of years ago, President Obama asked universities that were doing days of service to focus them on interfaith dialogue. So we actually had a couple thousand students come together for a period of reflection where they went out to do a service project. It was on September 11th. This was 2 years ago. And they went out and did their service project, and they came back and reflected on the meaning of that project, within the terms of their traditions. And that was a kind of one-day thing, and it was something that President Obama had asked all the universities to do. And I thought it was, it was a pretty good event, but I don't know how sustainable that was, because again, it's hard to get the interest of students in these issues unless they already have those interests, which of course, we do have a small, powerful communities that do have those interests. We have a strong Newman Center, we have a strong Hillel house, and there's a lot of service activities that organize the rest of the campus in its service, community service, come out of those religious communities, but that doesn't seem to translate into the growth of those communities beyond their core membership.
Thanks.
So I'm not sure that this answers the question of faith, but Ronald Dworkin, who just recently died, wrote an article, or the article was published in the New York Review of Books.
Yeah, I read the article.
We read the article. So, the 2 major issues that he talks about is how do you have a religious sense without a God? That's really what he's talking about. And the 2 things that he comes up with are, one is a sense of awe or mystery that people need, and the other has to do with morality. And those are somehow the core things that he retains from having given up the traditional theistic kind of beliefs. I'm just wondering if you'd comment on that.
Yeah, well, but he actually has, his position, he wants to argue that morality, not only morality, but that moral truths are independent of religious belief because of a metaphysical position he holds, which is a metaphysical realism about values. And that happens to be a philosophical position that he's developed over a long period of time. It's, within philosophy, it's of course quite a controversial, as a meta-ethical position, a metaphysical position grounding ethics, it is quite a controversial position. I thought it was a powerful essay. He's a great writer. I knew him for many years. I debated him at Berkeley on occasion, and was sorry to see his passing a very short while ago. I think it is an interesting it's an interesting philosophical position. It's not going to take us very far in addressing the issues that we're addressing now, because of course it begins with the premise that moral beliefs are quite indifferent to, that whether a moral claim is true or false, right or wrong, is a matter that is totally separate from whatever religious interest one might attach to those claims.
That's exactly.
Yeah.
Here's the mic.
Oh. Thank you indeed. I'm interested in this contrast between truth claims and importance of belief. It seems I certainly can imagine
some claims that would be important to a religious believer to which that person would attach low epistemological value on your scale. But it seems to me if you believe that certain kinds of belief are important, not just for you and your tribe, but for society, then it's not so easy, is it, simply to separate the truth value from the importance. And you'd move, wouldn't you, according to your understanding, down your scale or up, whatever it is, to 1 and 2, which seem to me the points at which argument can take place. Above 2 on your scale, there's no real argument, you're just testifying. I think this, I think that, you believe, and you're sort of enlightening one another, but you're not really persuading people or trying to persuade people of the truth of the importance of this belief. Is that right, and could you comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is right. The only, maybe a slight caveat there would be, I would say that let's call it level 3, which is the level at which you think that that the other person, even if that person doesn't share your belief, should not just respect it, but think that for you it's the right belief to hold, right?
Yes.
That's one of the ways in which you can test your belief. You could actually say, look, you could ask a Muslim friend, should I as a Christian believe this? In fact, you can even imagine a Muslim friend who knows more about Christianity than you do, right? In fact, there probably are many such. So it's not as if argument becomes irrelevant at that level. But I think you're absolutely right, is that I don't think that you could use your convictions at level 3 to make a case that everyone else ought to agree with you on some important issue. And you've got to then find a way of finding a corollary of that conviction of yours that would be effective at level 2. And you see this happening all the time. For example, you may have a theologically grounded belief in a human stewardship of the earth, which for you has a theological basis, but you wouldn't use that necessarily in arguing with a secular friend about some policy involving climate change. So you've got to find a proxy for that could operate at level 2, in which you say, you know, if we don't fix this problem, we're all going to die. And that's a level 2 argument. It's not a level 1 argument because not all the experts agree, but it's a level 2 argument because those who believe that probably think the people who don't agree are mistaken and are actually making a mistake, not just that they have a different perspective, but that they're failing to see something that they ought to see. And that, of course, is exactly the level at which public debate about policy takes place and should take place. So people are motivated by what they believe at L3, L4, L5, L6. They're motivated by those things to make arguments that are effective at the lower, that is to say, the shareable level of argument.
Thank you for coming in today and for the talk. As someone who's graduated actually from both Georgetown and GW at different times, it was interesting about the curricular thing that you were talking about. One of the courses I teach here out of the theology department is our Problem of God class, where we really raise a lot of these type of questions for the students. And you were saying earlier about, you know, at GW, the growth of, let's say, groups of people who consider themselves nuns, and we have that similar sort of phenomena here at Georgetown. To just speak a little bit about, by not having let's say, it would be interesting here if we ever sort of, you know, it would cause an uproar if we ever abandoned sort of having that idea that this is a mandatory course like Problem of God, whereas we don't really do it based on student interest. It's really based on, we think this is vital to ask these type of questions formatively about the similar experience at GW about, you know, is it so much a matter of question of their interest or actually enlightening them about the type of questions they might be asking? And sort of what does that look like, do you think, in your context? It's just interesting as a secular university.
Well, yeah, I think it would be much harder at issues like mine to actually, let's say, impose that as a requirement on students than at a Catholic university, where even for non-Catholic students, you could plausibly say they ought to know something about religion, right? We have requirements. I don't know if you have that requirement or not. I mean, that they all have, yeah. So it makes, I mean, but again, that makes sense within your context. It'd be awful hard to sell that at a secular university because there are a lot of people on the faculty of a secular university who think not only are religious beliefs false, but they're pernicious. And in fact, they're anti-intellectual, they're anti-rational.
We would have the same type of
you would, yeah.
Here, you know,
well, you know, you have the same.
At Georgetown, I think it's similar in terms of if you were to hold the whole faculty, but still the commitment that we're going to have that as being part of the curricular framework. I mean, you wouldn't give up on having physics or something like that not part of the curriculum because of the fact that people might disagree with the teaching of it. It's just
No,
interesting.
I think that's right. I think that's certainly true. But I mean, you have the ability to make this happen, being a Catholic university, that because you could plausibly say to people, why'd you come to a Catholic university if you didn't think we were going to require you to think about these issues, right? It's a little harder for me to make that case. It's harder for me to say, why did you come to a secular university if you didn't think we were going to talk about God? I mean, it's a little harder for me to make that claim. I can exhort people to have that interest, and students know I wrote this book, so they're free to kind of evaluate that. But
So you couldn't even have a course called The Predicament of Belief, Science, Philosophy, and Faith?
you could. Oh no, you can have the course.
Even a course like that couldn't be required?
Required. Yeah. Well, I mean,
Sounds pretty general, but
well,
still.
wouldn't that involve requiring all of my students to read my book?
That might be a reason.
That strikes me as potentially could be identified as a conflict of interest there. I don't know.
All right, we have time for maybe two more questions. Are there any other students like to pose a question? If not, there's a hand back here and then a hand up here on this side. And then we'll wrap up.
I'm Amjad Chaudhry. I'm from Ahmadiyya Muslim community. And the morality and belief that was more interesting to me, that the morality come from, I think, from the belief that religious belief you have, that's where the morality come from. The other thing is that we think that the God have created all the religion, and after the other religion is created, they have no connection to God, and so are the many other religions are right here, and that's where the pluralism come from. And I think at the end, we are at the later days, and the second coming of Messiah will open up the stage again and combine all the religions together. And I think this is the God's act, and we are just waiting for that. And as a Ahmadiyya Muslim community, we think that the second Messiah had come, and he's working on the same reason.
Okay. No, I appreciate the comment, sir. I don't have any. I think it's a question to answer, but thank you.
Okay, final question?
Yes. I'm Ron Laker, a member of a mainline congregation here in D.C. I read your book. I'm a non-academic, so I feel a little out of place in this group here, but I found your book so fascinating. And I'm wondering, the only religion books that I see that are popular are the self-help, that vein. How do we get people, we say we're a Christian nation, or a religious nation, I'm sorry. We say we're interested in the sciences, but how do we get people to really consider these questions that I think are at the base of the problem of most of the nuns? And I can speak for my own 4 children and 9 grandchildren, that's the direction we've gone in, because we say these are all out of bounds. We shouldn't be approaching those things. How do we make this more popular?
There are potential holiday gifts there, I think, to a lot of people.
I've given them already.
I appreciate that. That's good. That's very good news. Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, the religion. One of the most successful areas of publishing right now in this country is religion. But if you go to a religion section of a bookstore, if you can find a bookstore, what you'll find is it is largely spiritual books on spirituality and so on, and the theology and history of religion sections have really shrunk. Unfortunately, that's true in many other areas as well, including history and literature and so forth. So you're pointing to the fact that we've got, and it's traditional in this country to be a little bit anti-intellectual anyway, but I think it's compounded by the fact that there are a lot of people out there that are purveying forms of religion that others would call therapeutic or various kinds of marketing that are going on for self-help technologies and so forth, which are a very long-standing tradition in this country and have sort of eclipsed people's ability to talk about these issues. Part of it, I think, has to do with the fact that, after there was a wave during the so-called neo-Orthodox period, under the influence of Karl Barth and others, and then we had sort of an American equivalent of that with the Niebers, who had some, prominence during the post-war period. There was a little bit of a time there where it looked like there was going to be a very active intellectual, public intellectual space for theology, but that just sort of has waned for a variety of sociological reasons that we could talk about. So I agree with you about the problem, and I think it is a matter of education, and one of the reasons we write this book is to, well, I'm very glad that someone who's not an academic is reading it, because we did not intend this for an exclusively academic audience by any means.
Okay. Well, thank you. This has certainly been a wide-ranging conversation and exciting. We're glad that you spent some time with us. We could delve into these issues. I do recommend the book, which came out with Oxford just a couple of years ago, right?
And it's about to come out in paperback.
It's about to come out in paperback. We don't have a stack out here, but you know where to find it. And look for other events on our website. Sign up for our mailing list. We have a lot of interesting luncheon discussions like this one. Thank you for coming out, and please join me in thanking Stephen Knapp.